So in terms of, the safety and feeling heard and, you're in predominantly a male driven industry in terms of IT managed solutions. Like I mentioned at the beginning, one of the few women leaders. Let's talk to our young women entrepreneurs. Like anything to share with them in terms of what it was like to go through. And, you and I briefly chatted once a couple of years ago about how it was tough for you. Some men were super chauvinistic, I think, or they were just.
Yeah, they still are. There's a huge contingent of, privilege in that industry. And still at the elite level in technology and in IT, it's still predominantly white men, right? And, there's a lot of diversity in technology itself, but in the space that we play, the space that I've grown up in, it's all a bunch of white men. And
there must be talented women.
Of course
Are they hesitating to step up? What do you think is?
I don't know. I think it's the culture of IT. There's a lot of women leaders in, the financial parts of a business, in the marketing parts of a technology business. But, actually leading the business itself, it's still few and far between. Now, I grew up in the organization, worked there in the 90s and the 2000s, and it was a different world. It was a lot of boondoggles. It was a lot of...
Boondoggles, is that the word? What's a boondoggle?
Is that not a common word?
I don't know. It might be, but I have never heard it. I just want to, in case our guests haven't heard of it.
Yeah, thank you. No, I these expressions, right? But so in the heyday of success in IT and things were booming and there was a lot of money to be made, lots of money being spent. And in the big organizations, the HPs, the IBMs, they would throw parties, right? Like that's a boondoggle. Like, they have Christmas parties. They take you to conferences and it would just be, party all night and then conference during the day. Like it was just constant, parties and drinking.
I appreciate the education because I didn't know what in the world that would be.
That's what it means to me.
That's fair. That's fair.
So, I had to navigate that as a young woman in a predominantly male, industry where, women were 10% of the people in the room. Maybe it was 20%, but it became 10 and 5%, even less as I rose through the ranks, if you will. I was often the only woman in a room of leaders. And I'll never forget this one conference, this leadership conference that we were at. And there had to have been 30 or 40 different leaders from across Canada of different resellers across the country. And I was the only woman in the room. And the gentleman who was hosting it actually said, I'd like to thank Joanna for being here so we can call this group diverse.
Wow, you're kidding.
Yeah. There wasn't a black man in the room, an Asian, it was all white men and me.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how did that make you feel? Do you remember?
Intimidated, but I read a book by Sheryl Sandberg, Lean In, previously, and the big thing that stuck out with me was sit at the table. This is advice I could give. Women often don't sit at the table. I would purposely walk to the front of the room and there'd be tables and I sit at the front. I would make sure that I'd be seen. Walk into a boardroom and it's chairs around the table and then it'll have chairs at the back because it's for overflow, right? And you walk into that room and there's men sitting at the table and the women will walk in and they'll sit in the outskirts. I'm like, get to the table.
Good.
Right? And it can be intimidating, but you've got to be heard. Like if you pay attention in a room of men, nobody puts their hand up. Nobody waits to speak. They just speak.
Right.
And so I've learned to just speak, not interrupt. You find your place, but you still do it with professionalism and you try and set an example. But, you don't back down. And I think things are changing. I think that, thank God the world is evolving and diversity is far more prevalent just naturally.
Right.
And I think the youth today have a lot more understanding and tolerance than those of our parents' generation and even our generation in some cases. And one thing I learned also is just be yourself, be your authentic self, right? Like I modulated myself throughout the years, which I think is what led to burnout as well. But it's twofold. I modulated to fit in and to make sure that, I think most of it was because I needed to feel safe. And I didn't necessarily feel safe in these rooms or at these conferences, so I had to really navigate men's personalities in order to be heard and to feel safe. My father started this business, my brothers in the organization. I've had some incredible male mentors. This is not a hands wide swept thing, right?
Of course.
It exists, the misogyny, it exists at a higher level. And even at lower levels, as women, as marginalized people in organizations, you really have to know your worth and you have to just live your authentic self because the good stuff will come.
Yeah, and I can relate to that. In my banking days, I was a banker for 17 years, and I started as a teller, worked my way all the way up to a senior manager at Scotiabank. And, I saw, like, when we talk about these things, from the outside, you could see, how we've evolved, like, even just as a society in terms of, having far more respect, whether you're, a man or a woman, and truth be told, some of the most successful companies are led by women because women are super fantastic in their leadership roles, right? It's almost like just innately.
Maybe nurturing.
Yes, they're nurturing and they
collaborative.
Yes.
Can make decisions.
Yes.
Yes.
Like, there's a lot, and that's why it's so important. I find anyway, my experience has been is trying to surround yourself with strong women. Because, you're only going to learn and benefit. And having, again,
different perspective.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. And so I've seen that over, I remember I was 17-year banker wearing a tie every day. Yeah. Like I remember cleaning up my house, a whole bag full of them. But that's sort of how society has changed over the years, right? And I think it's a good change. Yeah. But I will say it's important not to forget, the podcast is called Old School New World. Old school values and principles are still important.
Absolutely.
Right? One of my companies or my brokerage, DNA Lending Group, it's called DNA because we're born with innately good human qualities. Yeah. Right? Like we lose it because society changes our views or men are not supposed to cry. Only women are supposed to get emotional. Yeah. And that's completely not the case,
We're all human first.
Oh, and some of my most amazing growth happened during the most emotional time. I've never met a man, woman, or child who's ever had a heartfelt cry, finish that cry, say, "Oh, I feel terrible."
Yeah.
Ever. Yeah. Like, and if you know someone, I would run away from them. And for men, anyhow, and we need to understand it's okay to be vulnerable. Yeah.
We're not welcomed, actually.
We're not supposed to be, oh, yeah, we're the tough guy. We're not going to allow, but it's tough for a lot of men. And that's why, they deflect. And if they're in a position of leadership and power, and they don't know how to be vulnerable,
you're damn right.
Guess who's going to take the brunt of it?
Yeah.
The team, women, someone that they are intimidated by, whether it's a man or a woman, but, typically that's what happens, and it's coming more to the forefront and it's coming more, if you're not comfortable with something, speak about it. Yeah. But again, it's up to leaders.
Yeah. But there's still cultures that don't provide that safety. Hell, I had one of my own.
Yeah.
And it's a core value of mine and always has been. And I allowed my organization to ultimately become that space. And so It was, it can happen to anyone. So you really have to be aware of your own energy and the way you're feeling, because that's just going to resonate throughout the whole organization and through your whole journey as an entrepreneur, right? You shouldn't make decisions, based out of fear. If you're not in a calm place or in a good space, your decisions, won't necessarily be the best ones for you or your venture.
Yeah, and listen, it's tough sometimes when whatever it is you're doing, building a business, in the business, leading the business, it's hard to detach emotion, but it's important to take a breath sometimes. I'm guilty of it. I could be an impulsive person. If I'm dealing with a lender or trying to figure out something with the team, I've learned and it becomes so much better to take a minute. Well, if you don't think that was the right way, it's important to recognize it. Yeah. And then be aware. That's the authenticity. You need to make sure you're tapped into, how you're dealing with things. So I think that's
and you're not being just reactive and getting stuck in like something that's happened before, or you get your back up or something. Like, well, wait a second, why am I feeling this way?
Exactly. And sometimes a lot of the time, if somebody has done something that maybe is rubbing you the wrong way, it probably has nothing to do with them. Yeah. Maybe it's something that internally that they're doing that you need to figure out. But that's, another topic for another day.